3, 2, 1. Hi, I'm Dr. Mark Cucuzzella coming to you this morning from West Virginia, Shepherdstown, West Virginia. I'm going to position my phone here so it's a little better. Tilt it up a little bit here. So I'm sitting out here on my porch, and Glenn, I have a hat here from your country, comrades. This was 2013, and I enjoyed visiting Cape Town then. Spent maybe about a week in Cape Town, did a course with Prof. Noakes there on running, and at that time I heard Prof talk about nutrition, and that was really refreshing because in America I was coming to some of the same conclusions as Prof. Noakes. As a distance runner, we were all raised on the high carbohydrate diet, and it worked for me. I'm 50 years old now. It worked for me maybe for 40 of those years, and then I just things started to change. I started to wake up at 2 in the morning every morning, needing more cereal. Every 2 or 3 hours I needed to have carbohydrate. My family has diabetes, heart disease, and I didn't understand it. And then I started working with the military, learning a little bit about obesity because I was assigned to help with failures of the fitness test. And in the U.S. military, if you fail your fitness test, you lose your job. So there's people have skin in the game, and it was a really important issue. This was about 2010. New chief of staff came on board, and he tightened the screws on the fitness test because there were all kinds of complainers about how it was done. It seemed like every couple years it was a new test, whether it was a bike test, step test. People were afraid of the run test initially because people would be dropping dead at coronary events. And that's why they started shifting to these different tests. And then new chief of staff came on board and said, well, I run, we're going to make it a run test again. And the failure rates went up to like 20 to 25%. So I was brought on to help with the running program, and that's got me into nutrition because I noticed there was this kind of linear pattern. Just line the graphs up. As people's BMIs were higher, their failure rates were higher. Now, I had an assumption, as almost every, including Prof, and down there in South Africa, we kind of had assumed, and this was already just a known fact that, well, you are gaining weight because you're eating too much and not exercising enough. I mean, that's determined, no debate, and that's what my bias was. But I had 6 months to develop a program for the airmen to help them pass the fitness test, and when you get some time, you just randomly start searching things, and things were starting to pop up on the internet then, and I came across an article by Gary Taubes, just random searching, and it was called Maybe It's All Been a Big Fat Lie. This was a 2002 article, and I read this article, and I kind of paused because I work in a #1 obese state in the USA, or maybe 2, depending on Mississippi, West Virginia. We seem to be, kind of fighting each other out for the top bar there. And I read that, and it was like, wow, that's fascinating, because in my practice, even though I would always tell people they had to get in this negative calorie balance of 500 calories and multiply that by 7, and you could lose a pound a week, but I never saw that work, and it didn't really seem to make sense. And then I read Gary's book, his first book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, which was about a 450-page tome, no wasted words. I read that like twice, and the physiology made sense, and what I just watched in my career had made sense. I'd already been practicing medicine, and I'd say practicing because we should be practicing. We're learning new things every day. At that time, almost 20 years of medical practice. And then I started giving, it made sense. I started looking at my own diet and life, and at that time my fasting blood sugars were 120, my HDL was in the 40s, and my triglycerides were over 200. So I kind of like paused and said, wow, I got this problem, but I don't have obesity, because like Prof, I was an endurance runner. I'd run 10 miles a day to keep my mental sanity. So I was actually burning the calories off, but I was becoming insulin resistant. So I flipped everything on its head for my own diet. That was my last bowl of cereal. I had shelves full of it, but that was it. And stopped the cereal and the grains at about 2010, 2011. And all of a sudden, it was just great. I just felt better. I didn't wake up in the morning. I could go from breakfast and didn't even need lunch and could make it to dinner. My energy came back. I wasn't hangry all the time. My goal wasn't weight loss, or like most of the patients I was seeing, and we didn't even probably know what pre-diabetes was, even though my labs reflected pre-diabetes with fasting sugars in the 120s. I don't remember even using that term maybe until about 2 or 3 years ago when the literature started talking about it. But I had metabolic syndrome by definition if you look at all the components. And I started, I had 6 months and I visited maybe, 80 military bases giving seminars on the fitness test, like strategies of passing the fitness test. And after reading Gary's work, I started asking this question at every seminar. We'd usually have about 50 or 100 people there, at all levels, some senior officers, senior enlisted, people in their 40s, even up into their 50s, and then you'd have your 18-year-olds, new enlistees right there. And I'd always ask the question, has anyone in the room lost 50 pounds and kept it off? And maybe a hand would go up, maybe 2 hands would go up, and I'd ask the question, well, what did you do? And it's 2010, the word LCHF wasn't in existence, but paleo was. The paleo was starting, they'd say, well, I'm doing paleo, or I got rid of sugar, I got rid of all the bread. There were things being published out there, but it was across the board. They did Atkins, people use the A word, they weren't afraid to say it. They did Atkins. And these were the people who'd kept it off. So, okay, here's some case studies, and I hadn't had a single person raise their hand and said, I went on that low-fat, the standard AHA. Well, I got rid of, all the eggs and butter and cheese and, started to eat grains, and I lost all this weight. I just never heard that happen. So after that 6 months, I came back to my medical practice in West Virginia and went into a meeting and said, I think we're feeding our diabetics wrong in the hospital. Because the lowest carbohydrate count diet that we could give a diabetic was the ADA, 1,800 calorie ADA diet, was 60 plus grams of carbohydrates a meal. And then we always covered this with what we call a sliding scale insulin. And sliding scale insulin is where you match, so say, I'm Mr. Jones in room 203, come in, check my morning blood sugar, it's 200, and you're going to feed me pancakes and maybe a little side sausage, a glass of juice, and some chocolate milk. And so we would say, okay, well, we need to cover that with 8 units of insulin. And that would be how we'd play the game. And if the sugar was well controlled, I would get this nice smiley checkbox that I'm a good doctor and doing a good thing because I'm managing their blood glucose. And that's how we trained residents and students. It was just a given that that's the way it was. So I came into a meeting and questioned that and challenged it and said, okay, I think there's a better way to do this. How about this? How about we create a pathway to not give carbohydrates and not use sliding scale insulin? And that didn't go over too well, as you can imagine. But they did, what was interesting about that day was they compromised and they said, okay, we're going to put a 45-gram button. We just started an electronic record. So they actually okayed a 45-gram per meal button, and they allowed me to hand text if I had something specific, meaning I had this, we call them dot phrases. You put like dot, mine is dot low carb, and it auto-populates with 10-gram carb meal. It says double eggs, double meat, extra salad, no bread, no sweet drinks. So and the kitchen understood that. So when I was on hospital service, they didn't argue about that. And what was happening at the time, I don't know, there were probably 20 nurses came to this meeting, and several of them have metabolic syndrome. People started to do this themselves and started losing weight. So we probably have 3 nurses on staff who've lost 100 plus pounds. So started to get these internal champions who were saying, look, Mark, I think this is what we need to do with all of our patients, because they would be handing out, by protocol, by their requirements, the CDC, ADA, we had to hand out these diabetic handouts, and your audience is already well informed, but you would just cry when you saw these. So if you're a diabetic in any hospital now, go in today and have the nurse print out the diabetic education handouts. When they go home, it would be the foundation of the diet is eat whole grain. I kid you not, it is still out there. So the nurses are saying, this is like, we don't like this. And we started kind of this underground mission to really do this right and do it by protocol and make this legit. So now in 2017, this is 6 years later, it has the blessing of our hospital that we can go into a patient room, and this is how I address it. I say, Mr. Jones, your A1C is 8. I write down, I kind of just draw out insulin resistance in the same way that Steve Phinney has that spectrum, insulin sensitive, insulin resistant. This is what happens through time, and they kind of define where they are on that spectrum. And they understand immediately. I say, well, okay, so if you're insulin resistant and your insulin levels are high, and your high insulin levels are driving your diabetes, your high blood pressure, your cardiovascular disease, what hormone do we need to get rid of? And they say, insulin. That makes sense. Okay, well, we talked about the things that drive the insulin, so what things do you need to do with your diet? And they answer the question. They say, well, it looks like I got to get rid of all the stuff I eat, which is like everything. Yeah, so no kidding, I've never had a patient come in with metabolic syndrome who's like eating eggs and bacon and vegetables and beautiful, because it just doesn't happen. They're all eating all the stuff, but they get it. They see the elephant in the room. I say, well, you have a choice. Okay, you can go down this path and be a medical patient for life and, take shots, take pills, visits every, 2 weeks to this specialist, that specialist, get these blood tests, check your sugar 15 times a day, do all this, really intensive management. So we, as doctors, when patients are ill and they have multimorbidities, which diabetes is multimorbidity. They all have cardiovascular disease, joint pains, migraine headaches, high blood pressure, lipid, they have all these multimorbidities, which all need intensive medical therapy by definition of the medical establishment, which I'm part of. I'm a physician at a medical school, major medical school. But, I'm a 50-year-old guy with 2 kids and, I don't know, about 4 jobs. And if a doctor told me, we had to double down and really intensify your management and it's going to take all this time, how does that fit in my life? It really doesn't. So I give them this option. I say, well, there's this other option that you can actually get healthier. It's like a fork in the road, and take the left and you're a medical patient, take a right and you can get healthier. Do you want to learn about that option? And maybe 1 out of 20 says, nah, I really don't. I just keep doing what you're doing. And in that case, there's something going on with that patient. There's something else under their hood. They have depression, financial stress. Then we have to address, okay, why do they just not care? Because they really do care. I've never had a patient who doesn't want to be well. But, almost all say, yeah, just tell me about that. And, at least I'll hear it. And usually I'll get the wife or the husband, depending on, children, who's in the house cooking for them, who's their support. Because you can't just do this on your own in an environment that's not going to help you. So, and no kidding, the handout that we use is realmealrevolution.com food list. I still use the original green, yellow, red, not the newer one, which has a little more nuances. I just want them to understand the very basics of what foods have and don't have carbohydrates. But we make this a positive thing. So if any of y'all look at that list and you look at that green list, and if you're a West Virginian farmer and you've been brought up on eggs and bacon and wonderful vegetables and butter and cheese, and I say, look what's back on the table. How's this sound? You can have 2 eggs in the morning for breakfast, put some avocado on that, go to the garden. Yeah, you can have some bacon, it's okay, that's not going to give you a heart attack. And sure, you love that T-bone steak, it's okay. Just get rid of all the, I call it the GPS, grains, potatoes, sugar, starch, make it really ridiculously simple. And I just do it for 2 or 3 weeks. That's all I want you to do, 2 or 3 weeks. See what happens. If they're on insulin, we reduce it, and I give them my text message. And on we go, and it's just crazy. If they do it, you all out there know that it will work. But they need to know this is not 1 day, 2 day, because they get that kind of funk. I tell them, you got to get the salt. All the basics that they're sabotaged out of. You read the advice, if you have this or that, high blood pressure, get rid of salt, get rid of fat. If you go to the AMA, ADA, CDC Prevent Diabetes page, this one will just blow your mind. Because the nutrition advice is reduce fat, reduce calories, exercise more, reduce salt. Not one mention in this page, not one word about sugar. It doesn't say anything about sugar in preventing prediabetes progression. Not even an afterthought, which, they're not people out there in the general public aren't even given that option. And if you look at those pages, that's the medical eminence. The CDC, the AMA, the ADA, these are all the people that we should be trusting as, the authorities. But, I tell patients, be smarter than your doc. Go out there and see what works for you. How's this working for you? Mr. Jones, go do 3 weeks on what the CDC tells you to reverse your prediabetes and eat to satiety, because no one can, starve themselves with willpower, you know, probably for more than 3 days. You know, it's why all the New Year's resolutions fail. So, I mean, that's just kind of sad. We're fighting that. You know, when we know that those things are going to help someone who has insulin resistance metabolic syndrome. You need the salt, you need, and even the ADA, the American Diabetes Association, in their scientific publications say this: carbohydrates are the main drivers of blood glucose. I mean, that's a sentence, that's right there. So, I mean, I'm just trying to get them logically to answer this for me, and I've not yet had a logical answer. So if carbohydrates are the main drivers of blood glucose, and people who have diabetes have glucose intolerance and high blood glucose, explain why I'm supposed to get rid of fat now and just totally ignore sugar. It's illogical. So that's why, you know, Glenn, shows like this I think are important, because, you know, in my community now in West Virginia, you know, good friend of yours and mine, Melanie Miller, you know, we have community groups, and we have nurses now supporting people. We have friends and closed Facebook groups supporting people. So this is really the way it happens. You know, a community of healing or like-minded people that are just helping each other out to achieve a common goal when you're not getting that support from the system. And I'm just blessed now that my system at West Virginia University, you know, this has been a long trail, you know, a little bit of tears and some disruptiveness, but, you know, my system now is embracing this, and we're going to study it, you know. So, yeah, so thanks to, you know, my dean, Casey Now, Emma Eggleston. You know, we brought Gary Taubes out here by Dean Clay Marsh at Morgantown. So we supported Gary Taubes to come to a statewide conference just to pose the alternative hypothesis. In my community now, Melanie Miller. So how did this become large in West Virginia? You know, it wasn't because of me. You know, I'm just seeing people one at a time. I didn't even have a Facebook page. I wouldn't have figured this thing out, what I'm doing right now. But I don't know, it's a little over 2 years ago, I think Melanie will tell you the date's July 29th. You know, she came to a meeting. It was just like a community public health type of meeting where we're trying to community brainstorm wellness initiatives to deal with obesity and diabetes. This is, you know, this is it. This is the big elephant, you know, in the room in West Virginia. And people are throwing out ideas, well, we need more gyms and more exercise programs. And then someone even mentioned Weight Watchers, and I kind of cringed. And I raised my hand and said, well, what if you had a broken ankle and you know, you couldn't exercise? What are we going to do? Just take you out back and shoot you? I mean, it's almost as blunt as that. And there wasn't really much response to that. I said, well, look, you know, this stuff really doesn't work if you understand the science. And then after that meeting, you know, Melanie comes up to me and, you know, kind of tearful and says, wow, you know, that's me. I have a rod in my ankle and I gain 100 pounds. And she went and did, I think for her first book was New Atkins for a New You, you know, which was the book that changed Prof's life. And I said, just go read this book, you know, talk to me in a few days and see what you think, and just try it for a couple weeks. So she did it, and, you know, all in, got on board and started losing weight effortlessly, and, you know, 30 pounds, 50 pounds, 70 pounds, 100 pounds. And then, you know, I don't know, it was maybe about 4 months in, it's like, well, you got to tell people about this. So we had this little community meeting at our rec center. You know, we thought like 10 people would show up, and I think like 80 people showed up at that one. And then a couple, you know, maybe a month later, 150 people showed up, then 200 people showed up, and like 300 people showed up, brought Eric Westman out here. So it's just been growing, you know, at this grassroots level. And now, you know, I'm fortunate because now the grassroots is huge, and the top down, meaning, you know, West Virginia University is going to allow me to teach this within a medical school system. So that's how, I mean, it's slow change. You know, it's like moving a rock. You know, this is a small rock out here, and you can see how difficult it is to move. You know, we're a 24-bed hospital, and it's called a critical access rural hospital, and it's taken 6 years. But we hope that we can model something here in this small scale, study it, and we can take it to larger hospital systems. I applaud the work, and I think a lot of really good things are coming together now. I mean, certainly the work of Prof. Noakes over in South Africa and the trial. You know, he had, what, 1,800 pages of scientific evidence, and I mean, that should just be the case that the dietary guidelines need to change. I'm part of a group called the Nutrition Coalition, and you can look them up online, Nutrition Coalition. So a number of scientists and academic physicians led by our fearless leader, Nina Teicholz. So what we're doing is really using science. There's no products on that page, and we're just using science to try to reshape the U.S. dietary guidelines for America. Look at what the Public Health Collaborative in the UK is doing. So gosh, they're changing the world over there, from general practitioners' offices. So the internet, what Jimmy Moore is doing through podcasts. I've learned so much on podcasts. What Eric Westman's doing down at Duke. So many pieces are coming together. And, Eric said this, all boats rise with the tide. Virta Health, look up what Virta Health is doing with Sami Inkinen and Steve Finney and Jeff Volek, Sarah Hallberg. So they're really out doing the hard science. I'm just about to publish a paper on a survey where we had 1,500 low-carbers chime in, about their experience, and about 35% had been on it for 2 years. And the people that had measured A1C, so about a third of 1,500 had pre and post A1Cs. So the definition of diabetes by the U.S. standard is a hemoglobin A1C of 6.5. So prior to starting, 44% had a hemoglobin A1C of 6.5. After low carb, their intervention, whether it was 3 months or 2 years, their measured A1C, their diabetes rate was 5%. So we took, and these are people that stuck with it, so it's not a randomized trial, but it's just showing if you do this, you can do this, and you can get rid of your diabetes, 44% down to 5%. It may or may not be easy for each individual based on their response, but if you do it, it can work. So they're kind of like, anecdotes, but there's 1,500 of them out there. And now we want to kind of look at the succeeders. So the ones who, the waist circumference we measured is crazy. It's like 30% had lost more than 5 inches off their waist. I think 20% more than 50 pounds. A number of people were doing this just for athletic performance too. So not all people enter the low-carb space just for weight loss. I think that's where people think, oh, this is just for weight loss. But, I'm not trying to lose weight. I'm just an average guy. I'm a runner, and metabolically I have pre-diabetes. But, so I've found that the low-carb performance is just crazy. So I can go run a 50-mile race now, a race like this one here, Comrades. Maybe put 100 calories an hour in just to keep the blood glucose stable, give you a little bit of energy, but you're burning 400 to 800, maybe even 1,000 calories an hour, but you're using your body. You don't use what you eat when you run these long races. You got to use the fat on your body. So there's people using it. We had a presentation in my hospital. We did like a lunch and learn. Brought a few friends in our community who'd been doing this. One was a lady who had alpha-1 antitrypsin, or has alpha-1 antitrypsin disease, which is an inflammatory lung condition, which leads, she was near lung transplant. She had about 20% lung capacity, 20 to 30% by pulmonary function tests. And she asked me about 2 years ago, what about the ketogenic diet for alpha-1? And I'm like, well, I really don't have a clue. I haven't seen anything published, but certainly it can't harm you. Go ahead and try it. So she did it, and oh my gosh, so her lung function is up to 70% now. And she looks like a well-robust person, no oxygen. We had another lady who had rheumatoid arthritis. I'm not using names because this is HIPAA and privacy, but her rheumatoid arthritis off of her meds. So these weren't just, weight loss was kind of a side effect for these other intentions on doing low carbohydrate. We see fatty liver now in kids. Fatty liver is driven by your DNL, de novo lipogenesis. So you can't do the math on the number of liver transplants that we're going to have to do if we continue down this path. So my plea to the world is, well, certainly you can go ahead and listen to the authorities, listen to the AHA about coconut oil or something. Well, 1 or 2 people in the country now have cardiovascular disease. So I'm like, well, how's that working? We've been following their advice for a really long time, and now, 1 in 2 people have cardiovascular disease. WTF? If this was working, you would think that billions of dollars being spent, $300 billion will be spent in America this year on diabetes care. I think the NASA budget's like $18 billion, and this is bigger than the Department of Defense budget. So that just puts it in scale. So our country cannot afford the treatment of diabetes and its complications. So if we follow the guidelines by the authorities, at best we might not make it worse, but I think it's going to keep getting worse. We got to make it go away. So I believe there's going to be a day where there will not be another child born who will get type 2 diabetes, and that will take educating the mom-to-be, because we know a mother-to-be, if you go to the literature, if you're a mom with insulin resistance and gestational diabetes, those children are born insulin resistant with what's called macrosomia. They have a 6 times odds of being diabetic themselves. So we got to go back to the mom before the child's even born, and I kid you not. So this is all in at every sector going into the schools. So how does this change? It doesn't change in my office. I see a patient at a time. This has to go to policy. So we have a program in West Virginia at farmer markets, doubling SNAP, we call them. It's called food stamps. So this is supplemental nutrition funds for people that have what's called food insecurity. They can't afford healthy food and it affects their health. So I'm not sure how this is around the world, but if you're in America now and you look at the stats, the #1 item purchased with these supplemental dollars is soda. And to me, that's criminal. That's crimes against humanity right there. So we're allowing parents who cannot afford food, they get supplemental government dollars, and the #1 item is soda. So we double these dollars at our farmer market. So if you have $20 US on your SNAP card, eligibility card, you can go to a farmer market and it becomes $40. And but that's small grassroots too. We have to, really just totally overhaul policy. School lunches, they're reducing salt in school lunches, not sugar. So how do you change that? And it really comes down to the U.S. dietary guidelines. That's why the Nutrition Coalition's work is so important, because right now there's an independent scientific review going on for the 2020 guidelines. So things like SNAP, military rations, school lunches really defer to the U.S. dietary guidelines for America on what is correct. So if the U.S. dietary guidelines for America say reduce salt and sugar, salt and fat, not reduce sugar, by all means, they're just going to follow suit. So we have to really go after the guidelines. It's happening in Canada now, and I know that's Professor Noakes's mission there too in South Africa with this trial. He's like, well, the end result of this trial should not just be he's acquitted, but the dietary guidelines in South Africa have been proven to be flawed, and we should change the dietary guidelines in South Africa. So I'm kind of pushing now for a global movement. UK is doing it with the Public Health Collaborative. I think we need a global movement to change the dietary guidelines, not one country at a time, but really connect. I think the UK is probably the most ahead of the game with the Public Health Collaborative site. So really just see what they're doing, and it's all, they crowdfunded to start that site. Sam Feltham, thank you very much. He's a rock star over there leading that charge. But I think that's kind of all. I've probably rambled on long enough here from my porch, and got to get to work. But believe, Glenn, you've shared so many great resources. Just follow what Prof. Noakes is doing. He's on it. Steve Finney, Jeff Volek, Sarah Hallberg, Eric Westman. These are the guys and the ladies doing the hard science. Thank the people that are sharing the podcasts, because without that social media now and the podcasts and Facebook pages, our community Facebook page here, Melanie's page in West Virginia, I've seen so many good recipes. I would just wish I had time to cook them all, but I shared my picture of my omelet this morning, Glenn, with you, which is, pretty much knucklehead guy meal, 3 eggs and whatever's left over from last night's dinner. Throw it in a pan with some cheese and load it with guacamole and sour cream, and you're good to go for like 8 hours. But enjoy your day all, and it's been a privilege being on the show, and hope to get back to South Africa sometime soon, maybe this year's Comrades. It's on the radar. I may come back and do it. I think it's a down year, so I did an up year. And for those of you that don't know about the Comrades Ultra Marathon, it's the largest and oldest ultra marathon in the world. I believe there are like 20,000 people running this thing, through the South African desert. And it was really a spiritual experience, all these young African children out there giving you water, cheering, probably 1 million plus along the route. It draws you back. You're like, holy cow, I got to come back and do that. It was the hardest thing I ever did in my life. But after a day of recovery, it was the most rewarding, and it just has etched such a wonderful memory of South Africa. Thank you very much.